It's really great to be here today with some of the main players in the DeFi space. And just before we dive into the panel on DAOs, I'd like to ask each of you to give an introduction of yourselves and very briefly, just an overview of your project. We just lost Blake, I think, but if we could start with Stephen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, super. So I am Stephen Becker. I am the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Maker Foundation. The Maker Foundation is a separate entity from MakerDAO. And what MakerDAO is a decentralized protocol layer that sits on top of Ethereum and that provides the tools to the DeFi space. And it provides these tools in order to create value and grow this on-chain economy, which also includes the provision of a stable coin called DAI, D-A-I, that actually facilitates the transfer of that value. And as I said, I am the CEO of the Maker Foundation, which is independent of that, and it has given itself the responsibility of facilitating the bootstrapping of this project.
Okay, awesome. Corey?
Sure. I'm Corey Caplan. I'm the CTO of the GMM Foundation. So as Stephen noted beforehand, we have a DAO as well for DMM, or DeFi Money Market. And the foundation is responsible for bootstrapping our DAO as well. The difference between our two DAOs is we are goal-driven on offering stable and uncorrelated yield to the crypto market. We do this by actually taking real-world assets and tokenizing them in an on-chain format, and taking the yield that is produced from them and giving them to on-chain participants, particularly in the DeFi space.
Okay, awesome. Blake.
Hi, yes, I'm a VP of Finance at Bertallo. We are not a DAO, but we do engage with several DAOs. We are a SEC registered transfer agent that built a on-chain cap table, and now we are building and maintaining API connections between that shareholder registry and various private capital markets participants, custodians, ATSs and exchange venues, broker-dealers. And now we are working with a couple DAOs to bring these real-world assets to DeFi.
Okay, amazing. And obviously there's so much excitement and momentum around DeFi at the moment. Lending, staking, yield farming, something like 4.5 billion in locked value in DeFi protocols. So we're hearing about DeFi all the time. What we don't always hear about are DAOs. Why is that? Is it some image problem with the DAOs? Are they just not sexy enough? Why don't we have all this buzz about DAOs? Stephen?
Oh, absolutely. So the one aspect about a DAO, which is first and foremost, is that it's a little bit foreign when you think about it in terms of an organization. I mean, as an example, one of the first questions I'm asked is, what is your organization that you work for? And I said, it's the Maker Foundation. Oh, they say, oh, let's make a DAO. And they say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, this is a decentralized autonomous organization. Listen to those words. It basically lives by itself in its own space. And, the foundation is simply one of the super contributors to it. And, when you start from that basis, folks take a bit of a step back because they're used to companies and partnerships and LLPs and whatnots. And they get a sense of, well, how does this work from a transaction point of view? And they start thinking about contracts, like how do I contract with the DAO in order to get something done? And when you start delving into those intricacies, it starts becoming quite clear that there is a level of autonomy that is given to yourself to be able to interact with the DAO, a level of autonomy that you haven't really thought about before. You really want. Everyone loves the autonomy, but the thing with autonomy, it comes with its own risks. So that's both sides of the coin. You get all the freedom to do what you want and how you want to do it, but you also have to look after the risks that come with it. So the DAO is really, or rather a DAO is really, really interesting, but it really imposes upon a person to do their own research and figure out what it means to the full extent.
Right, okay. So you briefly mentioned the risks. That's actually one of my questions that I was going to come to. So what are some of the main advantages of a DAO and what are some of the disadvantages? And I assume that risk would come into that.
I think an easy thing from a beneficial standpoint is as Stephen alluded to, they exist without any direct involvement from any one individual because it exists kind of out there in the ether or out there anywhere. Without any one person participating, the organization can presumably continue operating. And with that, there is the really interesting notion of you don't necessarily know all the individuals that you're participating or working on this organization with, but you're all coming to similar conclusions and still moving the organization forward. It's decentralized by geographic region as well, so you have potentially people from all walks of life coming together to work on this one goal-driven environment. And those are some very, very strong benefits of it. But with it, there are some risks associated with it as well. And this is very DAO specific or DAO dependent. Just like how you say, I run a business. Well, what kind of business is it? Businesses are very abstract things, and they all have, similar missions in general. But the way that they get there can be quite different. And a similar thing can be said for DAOs. What is the work environment in which you are progressing forward? Does it require some level of trust amongst the organization or the key stakeholders in the organization? Some very interesting issues pop up as well, that Stephen alluded to, like how do you contract work to a DAO and deal with payment? When some people might have said the work was done, or maybe some people say the work wasn't done to satisfaction, how do you deal with releases of payment under these very highly granular sort of situations then? And different DAOs have different approaches to how they solve these different problems. And they are all palatable to some extent, depending on what the circumstances and how they want to deal with certain levels of finesse with these very intricate issues.
Stephen, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it pretty much covers off on a lot of it. The one aspect that I just need to really emphasize is that, in a free and open market economy, you find that decentralization, or rather decentralizing, is actually core to its robustness and its development. And what you see with a DAO is the sort of final expression of that. It's that last step that an economy can take to broaden the spectrum of opportunity for individuals and really get an expression of autonomy. And the reason I mention that is because that last step is very clear in terms of the benefits, but we still are trying to figure out what all these risks are and what they're going to look like. As Corey mentioned, there's a lot to do with the very fact that you're living in this belief system called law, and you need to comply with it appropriately. How do you do it when you've got these contradictions in front of you? And there are ways to do it, but you've got to be very cognizant of them before you engage into it.
Right. And Blake, you mentioned that you're working with DAOs. Have you had a moment where you're like, I don't know, banging your head against the wall, wondering who you're supposed to talk to?
One moment. There's a very good purpose for this community. When we started engaging with DAOs, and particularly with MakerDAO, we had the conversation that, is this a speed bump? Is this going to be adding friction? But the community input, the decentralization, the community control over shared risk and shared value, I think that's a very valuable thing. As an organization that's used to kind of contracting with partners, it's a change of pace for us. But I think that there's definitely benefits to it as well.
Mm-hmm. I think also, just going back to your original question about why do we not hear about them too much, or are they not sexy enough, for example? I found it quite funny, but I think realistically speaking, I think you'll start to hear about them more and more often now. I think if you look back on years prior, it wasn't a matter of DAOs not being cool enough or anything like that. I think the issue was the scaffolding necessary to support them just wasn't existing yet. And now we're starting to see more of that come into place. We see more DAO frameworks coming out, but also we think about simple things like, how do you manage the treasury of a DAO? How do you deal with the potential hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars they have in their disposal in order to grow their organization? Things like decentralized exchanges, decentralized portfolio managers, and more ways I can put the word decentralized in front of some traditional financial term in order to make it DAO compatible, didn't exist beforehand or wasn't in existence yet, but was being created. And now it's becoming increasingly more robust. We've seen frameworks like Compound become increasingly more popular, which now offers essentially on-chain money markets to pure on-chain treasuries. Decentralized exchanges are another thing that allow people to, or in this case DAOs rather, to exchange value from one coin into another completely trustlessly then. And it's very, very compatible with the DAO framework that almost any DAO would be operating by.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about some of these early frameworks and treasury management. From where I sit, having been in the space for 4 or 5 years now, everybody remembers these early DAO hacks or exploits or, things that had worked exactly as they were designed, but unanticipated attack angles. And I think that kind of turned people off from them for a few years there. But this reemergence of it, it's not, we're talking about this idyllic, fully decentralized DAO structure, but these things exist on a spectrum. You have these fully decentralized as we're talking about them, but then you have things like synthetics, which is transitioning from more of a centralized entity to more of a decentralized DAO, but you still see team members that are holding a significant amount of the vote. So this is being that sort of, as a novel user of this stuff, going into one of these environments where you're the small fish, and in synthetics you're working in collaboration or members, or in Compound's case, you're kind of navigating the whims of their VCs and then some of the other decentralized protocols that are using Compound's money markets. It's from a user's perspective, it's a lot to. It feels like you're up against a lot, and it's difficult to navigate. So I think that there's the very real just UX aspect of it as well.
Yeah, for sure. And so, panel, we're talking about governance today and token issuance. So, Stephen, how does governance work in MakerDAO?
Well, the governance works through the use of the MKR token. So first, if you have a look at MakerDAO, it is effectively made up of 2 tokens. The one is MKR, which represents the sort of governance token, and DAI, which is the stable coin. And what you need to do is sort of take a step back and say, well, fundamentally, what are you trying to do with this DAO structure? And the answer is you want to create stability, or you want to provide a stabilizing function. So when you reverse out of that, you say, well, how do you actually go about doing this? You start creating problem spaces and very clear legal points that the MKR holders, which as an aggregate is called governance, looks after these levers and makes sure that DAI remains as stable as possible within the broader DeFi environment. So how it works is really about starting quite a established end-to-end process about signaling an intention, and then finding sufficient momentum behind that intention to put it into a process. And this process is really important because it has to be almost as immutable as blockchain itself, where you go through this process and you find how much level of contention you can drop away from the process or whatever that you want to propose. And then finally coming up with a resolution in the final stage, which is committed to the blockchain, committed to Ethereum, stating categorically this is what the fundamental request of governance is. It is a rigorous process that ensures that there is reproducible research behind it, that there is enough consideration behind it, that you literally try and put this in place to decrease the amount of contention in that decision as much as possible. That's really the focus of what governance should be looking at.
Okay. Corey?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of shareable points between Stephen and I, but the one differentiator I'd say is because we are tethered to the real world in a lot of ways because of the real world assets that we're attempting to tokenize with ours, that we have this new angle that comes into play, which is we have different roles for different participants. So in a lot of ways, you just have the traditional DMG governance token holder that's responsible for voting on typical things like changing interest rate models around or potentially onboarding new tokens to earn interest off of. Like, for example, we actually offer interest on individuals that deposit DAI into our ecosystem to earn interest for it, that are funding the underlying loans that back the interest in the first place. And we're going to be holding a vote very soon to onboard potentially new stable coins and new tokens that the community has interest in actually earning interest on. But the difficulty then is, how do we deal with the fact that we're still an open protocol, so other individuals from different geographic regions can actually help onboard more real-world assets that produce interest in the first place. And we have this concept that we call principals and affiliates, which essentially the most closely connected thing or similar thing in the real world would be something like a MasterCard, a very, very large organization like that actually offers basically a higher status to very large processors of payments that are kind of like subsidiaries of the company. And we're actually working on onboarding these new roles into our DAO essentially over time, where these different individuals that are very, very important to the DAO serve different functions, and they still have similar rights that, or rather the same rights that exist for the same DMG governance holders, but they had extra opportunities at revenue because they're performing additional services on top of what's already required for the rest of the organization. So it's very, very specific just to our DAO and our DAO specifically, which is something that I alluded to earlier, that every DAO has different specialties associated with it. But overall, I'd say that that's probably one of the biggest differentiators between us. There's, of course, a whole bunch of other things that I'm glossing over when I talk about this specifically, but this is probably one of our biggest ones, like I just said.
And just think about it, does every DAO need to have a foundation? Or it needs to have somebody managing it from the outside?
I think Blake...
Well, not necessarily.
Sorry, go ahead, Corey.
Oh, I was going to say not necessarily. I think that there needs to be some kind of training wheels initially, just because the training wheels for decentralization is centralization. I think foundations have traditionally worked well in the past for doing that. But I'm sure Blake has some insight in this as well because he plays more of an outside role with it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to. You know, I applaud what Maker Foundation and Maker DAO does. And I think what's unique about that is their, value accrual mechanism, where by making good governance decisions, the Maker token will accrue value. But you'll see something like YFI a few weeks ago, which launched sort of in an instant, and then everybody was scrambling to get it. There's a team of developers behind it, but there's not really this foundation that's guiding and pitching things. And that's been a very efficient, fast-moving, well-distributed. I think if you look at top 10 addresses, it's one of the most decentralized protocols, like layer 1 protocols, full stop, but certainly DAOs as well. So it helps to have that kind of guiding light, for new ideas or things that are of a protocol's historical ethos. And I think as you start to talk about bringing real world assets into some of these environments, you're going to see a lot of that kind of butting heads within these DAOs. But it's not necessarily a requirement.
It's just to add on to what Blake is saying. I mean, funnily enough, Blake and Corey putting together, there is the spectrum. Nothing else. Even when you do something like I don't know, I call it Wi-Fi. I don't know if it's iffy or just it's called a yarn. But when you have a look at what happened to that organization, it was really interesting. I thought it was fantastic. It was kind of a North Star in saying, here's the next step in what decentralization looks like. But the problem there is there has to be, and this goes back to what Blake was saying earlier, you've got to have some sort of spectrum involved because there has to be a structure. There's got to be some sort of guardrails. And you can do one or two things. You can create an amorphous entity and sort of just deliver it into the system and hope it finds its own guardrails, or you start with a set of guardrails and then you try and deliver it into that. It depends on which way you think it should go. The sort of historic precedent was to start with guardrails and then put something into it. Now we've seen that the opposite can apply as well. It is really interesting and it's super fascinating, and I really look forward to the further DAOs that come out with these nuances and these attributes. And to your first question, Christina, about why aren't DAOs exciting? Because they're only getting exciting now.
Okay, and what's still stopping them though? Is there an issue on the side of regulation? I mean, according to different jurisdictions, is that still a stumbling block?
Definitely.
Well,
and I think it depends on which one you're looking at. Stephen, you think you should probably start with this one?
Yeah, this is actually very interesting because we've gone and spoken to quite a few folks in Washington and expressed the view of what decentralization means, especially at the intersection of regulation. And the analogy that I like to use, and we can get into the details of it. The analogy I like to use is, trying to regulate decentralization is like trying to regulate the ocean. It's, you can try, it's just completely impossible. But you can certainly regulate the ports, the shipping lanes, the ships, and all the activity on it. So if you keep that in mind, then you have this capability of understanding where regulation intersects with decentralization. And from my point of view, I would think regulators would be super happy because this is the first time in history that they can actually effect proactive regulation within certain constructs of walled gardens, as it were, where instead of reacting and waiting for the moment to discover what actually went wrong. If you consider the recession, the Great Recession of 2008, even the flash crash of 2010, it took regulators 4 years to figure out what happened. Now we're sitting in a situation where immutability, accessibility, transparency, and efficiency allows you to see what's going on right now. So this should be the best time for regulators to sit back and go, no, we're actual stakeholders and we actually got something to contribute.
And would you say that quite a bit of progress has been made in that direction over the years?
I think it's kind of gone one step back, two steps forward. And every time we find ourselves going one step back by some sort of comments in an article, or you hear some sort of discourse from a set of people, you realize that there are a lot more folks behind that actually wanting to push this forward. Because this doesn't only just touch on the DeFi space, it touches on central bank digital currencies as well. This really broadens the whole aspect out to the sovereign nations and how they wish to interact. When you think about the transfer of Fed level funds, FedWire, what are they going to do there? Real time gross payment settlement systems. They want to bring that down to the retail level. So imagine having an account with the Fed. It's all of this is interrelated. So trying to get your head around one is the same as trying to get your head around the rest. And that's what I suppose makes it a challenge, and it's super interesting.
Corey, do you have anything to add, or Blake?
Yeah, I think that it brings up a very interesting point, especially with the whole entire you can't regulate the ocean, but you can regulate the ports and the ways essentially in and out of the ocean. I think it's a very interesting point, but it also depends on the level of decentralization that the DAO you're speaking about has. Before you're talking about regulating a lake versus an ocean is two different things on the decentralization spectrum. And I think that DAOs like ours, for example, have some difficulties with that because there is something that's seizable at the end of the day because we do have these real world assets or access to them. And on top of that, there's also just different things of if you have a very, very decentralized DAO as opposed to a more centralized one, very traditional legal structures that come into play, like how do you sue them if something goes wrong? Things like that also become very difficult then. And I know that there are still attorneys to this day that are still trying to navigate how they deal with things around things like this. Risk disclosure, how do you deal with potential losses that happen and that propagate to the real world or to participants of the DAO or users of the DAO's services, for example. It's very, very interesting to see how this entire situation is unraveling, and certainly certain aspects of it are one step behind, then two steps forward. Certain things I think are very much so in the research phase, where prominent individuals in the regulatory bodies are still doing their fair share of research to figure out how these things work. But I think the greatest thing, which is what Stephen alluded to, is that these are organizations that operate transparently by nature. And transparency is their first attribute that they would probably describe themselves as, besides permissionless or semi-permissioned if they are. And that really does allow for very adequate research to be done before something wrong happens. When something wrong happens, that's where you usually see the lawsuits happen and the subpoenas or the cease and desist letters being sent out. And they have to kind of stop and freeze and then send over information so they can do the research to see what went wrong. But now we can do research way ahead of time into these large organizations, the decisions they make, how they get to these decisions, and who's participating, how many people, what their weight is, and all those different things. way before something bad happens, or as a matter of fact, they can see what's happening when things are working properly, all the way through and through, which is a really, really amazing thing. And it has me very excited about the overall industry and the direction that things are moving in.
Yeah, and those are both good points. I think in terms of, regulation, the first time we heard that is it sufficiently decentralized question is that 2017, 2018 time when we're talking about, is it a security? Is there an enterprise behind it? Is the efforts of the core team or, that lead developer who's a genius somewhere out there, does that constitute an enterprise? So I think you're going to see very, very similar activity on behalf of the regulators, because you're dealing with lending products, you're dealing with money creation, you're dealing with anti-money laundering, OCC, FATF, Treasury Department. They're all going to have eyes on this, and they're all going to be making judgments based on how sufficiently decentralized is this. Is there, a point of entry that they can regulate, as Stephen said? So I think it's going to be really interesting, and probably, in the context of a one step back, two steps forward type of conversation. I think it's going to provide some headwinds initially, but similar to what we saw with regulating cryptocurrencies and digital assets as securities or not, I think you're going to see a very similar type of progression on the regulatory front.
Great, and so expanding on that, as you were saying, we've seen tokens go from just tokens to utility tokens, security, platform tokens, exchange tokens, and now we're talking governance tokens. Is the language changing because of the regulatory aspect, or it's purely a shift on the governance, or to emphasize the governance factor? What's the difference?
I think it's in search of clarity on behalf of the users. I think this is sort of broader industry defined. When you're talking about DeFi, what is a yield-bearing token versus an incentive token versus a governance token? These are all, it sounds minor to the outside, but these are really important distinctions for the user. So I think it's more of just an emergent trend that's, there's market demand for these distinctions, but people have gotten used to them and expanded on them.
Yeah.
Anything to add on that, Corey? As I know, DMD is a governance token as well. Okay.
Yeah, I think that clarity is probably one of the biggest things for it. Beforehand, like you said, the word token itself is very broad by nature. So it's, what function does this token serve? Is it an exchange token where some enterprise split it up as a means to share revenue with the users, or offer some other functional purposes for it? And the industry itself, it's very funny to see. It's very tech oriented. It's very it can be very confusing, and it's very, very deep. It's very easy for someone to dive very deeply into the industry to learn more about it. And so these kind of very, very nice little vocabulary words, or little mnemonic devices, will just propagate to the top to make things very easy to understand. So you can very easily categorize things and just get a very quick one-sentence snippet of what it is. And you're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And now I can have the right frame of mind when I'm actually going to look into it further. Or just, you leave it there because you know what it is and it doesn't interest you. I think it also plays hand in hand with this. The consumer is very, very snappy, in that they kind of go from one thing to the other very quickly, and want to be able to get a nice bite-sized piece of information about it before moving on to the next thing.
Okay, we're almost out of time on the panel, so I just have one final question, but I think you've already given your indications on this. Where is this going? Are we going to see more DAOs coming out after the growth of the DeFi movement? And where are we likely to be in the next few years? Stephen?
Oh, okay. Strangely enough, I think what will happen and what should happen are two different things. So let me tell you what should happen, and then maybe I'll put my wish out there and see if it works. What should happen is that DeFi, and specifically DAOs, should start focusing on servicing the real world. Really think about the very basic notion of the DeFi space is there to augment and to dovetail with the traditional world. It needs to take all that innovation and be able to say, well, this is really cool, this is really clever. We've got composability that we've never seen before. I mean, flash loans and the ability to use them on blockchain, which is not something you're going to see in the traditional world, needs to be able to focus its attention on servicing the traditional world instead of creating a little ecosystem for itself. That's what should happen. And we should see DAOs get created that constantly interact with and intersect with the traditional world. What's going to happen is that you're going to find that the DAO structure, it's almost like this new sort of token framework is going to be applied to almost anything. And we're going to see a proliferation of that, and it's going to effectively create maybe a new little bit of a bubble and then eventually come off. But effectively what's happened in the DeFi space is found a new innovation, and that innovation is going to be taken to its, to its extent.
Okay. Sounds like it could be a little bit messy, but.
Yeah, I do agree with Stephen, both of his points actually, about what probably should happen versus what will. I think that we're already starting to see a lot of new token sales pop up that claim to be a governance token, or they're making a DAO, and they're raising money for it. Or I've seen a couple of really solid projects that have been existing and working for anywhere from 1 to 2 years now and have a strong user base and are producing revenue for their protocol, and now they're going to transition to a DAO. And those are probably the better ones that I like seeing more so than obviously the quick cash grabs that don't make a whole lot of sense. But otherwise, though, I think that there's very, very strong merit to structuring an organization in this way, and it's very compatible with the ecosystem that's being created right now. DAOs fit very, very nicely into the DeFi space, and I think that as more products are built, as more scaffolding is put into place for the larger DeFi ecosystem, it's only going to make creating a DAO even more enticing, because there's more infrastructure for you to actually hook into and leverage. It's like the equivalent of, would you buy a computer back in 1995, 1990, before a lot of applications on the internet were already created, which gave your computer some utility? And the answer might have been no at the time, but then surely a couple of years later, as more applications came out and more scaffolding was put into place to make that computer more useful, sure enough, a lot of people took the jump then. And I'm expecting a similar thing to happen with DAOs as the larger DeFi ecosystem evolves and there's more creations.
I just got some last words from Blake, and then we're going to have to finish the panel.
Yeah, I agree with both Corey and Stephen here. I'd like to see some of these kind of pro rata representative governance structures cross over to more traditional organizations, cross over to the real world. I think what we will see happen, as Corey and Stephen said, probably this expansion of the model, probably in a cash grab type of sense. I think you're going to see, some big regulation that, heavy-handed DAO with this type of structure is not allowed. And I think you see a bunch of different DAOs kind of change nomenclature or minor change their structure. But I think it's an effective model, and I hope it does proliferate and cross over to other ecosystems.
Okay, well, thank you all very, very much for the panel today. That's all we have time for. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Appreciate being on with you.